You're listening to Veg Your Best. My name is Michelle Olander, and I'm a life coach. I use the tools I've learned through coaching and other modalities to support people as they start, restart, or re-energize their vegan and plant-based practices. Because there has never been a more important time to be vegan. This week, episode 112, Vegan History with Avery, Yale, Kamila. Welcome, everyone. Welcome and welcome back. You will hear some congestion and some nasality in my voice, I'm assuming. But I call many of you my Veg Your Besties, and I know you'll bear with me on this one because you've been along for the ride, all 112 episodes, and I've gotten to know a lot of you to some degree, and a number of you have honored me by getting in touch and talking about your goals, your struggles, your ideas, and I want you to know how much that has enriched my life in a way I can't even describe. And today's conversation is one of those opportunities I've been blessed with in this work. I get to meet very interesting people, and today's guest, Avery, Yale, Kamila, is someone who is helping us see the world and our place in it with new eyes. She's a journalist and a researcher of Maine's hidden vegetarian history. And I'm really looking forward to you all getting to know Avery, Yale, Kamila. She grew up on a dairy farm and, among many other pursuits, writes the vegan kitchen column for the Portland Press Herald in Portland, Maine. Now, one of my soapboxes is... I have a few, and if you've been listening, you know. But one of my many soapboxes is supporting our local journalists and newspapers. And I think after you listen to Avery talk about the work she has done, the stories she's unearthed, literally, you will want to underwrite or maybe even get involved yourself in ferreting out important issues and historic contexts in your hometown. Being vegan is a point of view and an ethical position, and it is far more than recipes, as I think you're going to see in our conversation that ranges from businesses to school lunches to soft serve ice cream and the Wabanaki Confederation, a group of First Nations people whose civilization stretched across Northeast, what we now call the United States, and included the area we now call Maine. Does that sound like a wide-ranging conversation? So I will get to it right now. We're going to include many of Avery's links and contact info in the show notes. But for now, I hope you'll just enjoy getting to know Avery, Yale, Kamila. Avery, Yale, Kamila, welcome to Veg Your Best.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. I've been following your work mostly via Instagram, and my virtual assistant, Nancy, is actually a Mainer. And she, I think the first time I heard about you was she sent me an article that you wrote.
Oh, that's so awesome.
So that's one of my connections there with you. So even though I'm a New Englander, born and bred, I didn't know your work, I think, until she mentioned it to me. So I would like nobody else to have to go without knowing about your work.
Oh, thank you.
So tell me, I'd like you to introduce yourself to my audience and tell me you're a journalist. You do much more than just journalistic work. But introduce yourself to my audience, please.
Well, my name is Avery Yale Kamila, and I'm a journalist in Maine. I have written a vegan food column for the Maine Sunday Telegram, which is the largest newspaper in Maine, since 2009. So I've been doing that for quite a few years. And there aren't very many such columns like this, very, very few. Generally, newspapers do report on vegan and vegetarianism, but it's not a regular thing. So it's really been a privilege and an honor to have this opportunity here in Maine. Maine has a huge vegan and vegetarian community and always has. And I think that's what we're going to talk about a little bit. But I've been writing for the modern vegetarians here in Maine and, people who are interested in the sort of food stuff I write.
So, Avery, what do you think having someone who's dedicated to this topic in the newspaper in Maine, how do you think that is different than having somebody who occasionally covers it? What do you think happens differently for the readers of the newspaper?
Well, I think that one thing that I'm able to offer in my column that is different from just a food journalist writing a story about a particular topic is that because I cover this as my beat, I find out about things that, people wouldn't know about if they were just dipping in here and there to write about it. But at the same time, I write about it from the point of view of a vegetarian. Now, a vegetarian's point of view is often wildly different from somebody who's not a vegetarian. So I'm able to bring that because I write it as a column. The columns are often very newsy. I write about news things, but I write it from my point of view rather than, the third person newspaper reporter's point of view. So I think that personalizes it and also adds a depth to what I can cover that somebody who was covering food in general across the state is not going to be able to pick up on a lot of the things that I've been able to report upon. For instance, this summer I wrote a story about the rise in vegan soft serve ice cream in Maine. Maine is a huge ice cream state, tons of ice cream everywhere. Tourists come here in the summer by the millions. Everybody wants ice cream. Well, in the last, I would say, 5 years or so, vegan ice cream at ice cream scoop shops has really increased in Maine significantly. And then this year, all of a sudden, there were a whole bunch of scoop shops offering vegan soft serve, which is different. It's that kind that comes out of the machine in the little twirly sort of thing. So, some people like that rather than the hard serve. And so that was something that I was able to pick up on this summer and write about, that if without the connections that I have, a reporter wouldn't have been able to spot this as easily. So it's that sort of thing that I can kind of ferret out and share with my readers.
So I find that very interesting because when I was looking into your work, because of your kind of dedicated niche in the topic, you are able to talk about Maine's history. You can talk about the economics of the self-serve or soft serve or ice cream for tourists. So that's an economic and business topic. And also you've covered children's lunches in the Maine schools. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I've done a lot of writing about that.
So that is, I'd love you to talk a little bit about what your work accomplished in that area. But I'd like my listeners to hear that's a big scope for just what might sound like a niche topic of vegan vegetarian affairs in just in Maine even. So I'd love it's such an I think sometimes people think, oh, that's very fringe, very small, very niche, as I say. And I don't say niche in a bad way. I like niche. I think it's important to focus. But just for my listeners to understand, this is not just recipes and trying to not use eggs in baking. This is very, very different. So please tell me a little bit about the more current work you did about school lunches in Maine.
Well, I've written a number of stories about school lunch in Maine and what the schools offer. I live in Portland, Maine, which is the largest city in the state and also is a huge hub of vegan and vegetarian activity. The schools here have had a vegetarian lunch on their menu since, I don't know, more, maybe about 15 years or something. They've had one of those. Might even be longer. It might be about 20 years. However, that was a cold lunch and it was mostly string cheese sticks and, it wasn't vegan. So it was based on cheese. When my son was entering kindergarten in 2018, I wrote a column basically saying, how strange it was for him to be entering the public school system after going to nursery school and being in the whole kid world where everything is very veg friendly. It's all hummus and carrot sticks, and, nobody's bringing out beef sandwiches to children or anything like that. But the Portland public schools, they serve beef all the time. They don't serve pork. They don't serve any pork because we have such a diverse community here, and a lot of, religions don't eat pork. So they don't serve pork, but they serve beef every day. So that to me seemed really shocking. So I wrote a column about it saying, like, look at all this beef on here, like for 5-year-olds, like, what is this? And, we've got this real vegetarian culture and we're just pumping out beef hot dogs every day. And I said, where's the vegan lunch? Now, a lot of people hooked onto that column. I think there was a Reddit thread that it started. And they were not happy with me. They had all sorts of choice words for me and what I could do with my son and my lunches. However, they don't matter. The people who matter are the school board and the superintendent, and they all agreed with me. And so it took a while, and it took a lot of meetings with the food service director, but Portland now has daily vegan hot lunches on the menu for all the elementary school students. So I think today's lunch is a veggie burger. So I'm not sure what the meat lunch is, but there's probably a hamburger and then a veggie burger. They usually kind of do the same sort of thing. But every day my son can go to school and, like every other kid, get a hot lunch. And, it makes it normal. It makes it, he doesn't feel, different. It helps support the school lunch program because, I understand that it's important to support the school lunch program. We don't want to stigmatize hot lunch and school lunch because there are so many children that rely on this. This is essential food, and we need to make it better. There's so many things that need to be improved about school lunch and hot lunch, and adding a vegan option is a major way for schools to head in that direction.
So that's fascinating. And it's just by bringing up a conversation which other people took and ran with, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was
right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So since today is Indigenous Peoples Day, when we're recording this, we can now maybe toggle back to kind of show the breadth of your work. This is current school lunches is now today in Portland, Maine, public schools. But you've also in your work uncovered a long history of vegetarianism and veganism, and also among the indigenous people of New England, the Wabanaki tribe.
So in Maine, it's the Wabanaki, and that's encompasses a number of different tribes, but it's the Wabanaki Confederacy, and so that represents the group of the tribal nations that are still in Maine,
and they're still located in Maine.
Right. And there's all sorts of people with Wabanaki ancestry in New England. The most well-known Native Americans in New England are probably the Wampanoags in Massachusetts, who are the people that the Pilgrims encountered when they sailed into this part of the world. So in Maine, it's the Wabanaki, and they have their own history, and there's tons of stuff we could talk about. But one of the things that I find, well, two things. I'll talk about two things. In exploring vegetarian history in Maine, what I encounter time and time again is historical erasure. So vegetarians are a minority group. We're a marginalized group. And vegetarians are also social change agents. They're part of a movement to change the world. We're not just sitting around saying we just want to eat our vegetarian food. No, vegetarians are out there trying to get other people to do it. So it's a social change movement. Social change movements, historians don't like that. They don't want anything to change. So people who are part of a marginalized group or part of a social change movement face historical erasure. So vegetarians have faced historical erasure, and the Wabanaki people and all other indigenous people face the same historical erasure within the archive. So there's a similarity there. Now, I found no historical tradition of vegetarianism among the Wabanaki tribes here in Maine. However, there are many Wabanaki who today are vegetarians. But what I have found in the history it's some very interesting things that have also been written out of history books and the archive. One of them is that in Maine, you will find repeated throughout history books that the indigenous people here were hunters and gatherers, hunters and gatherers, hunters and gatherers. I mean, I've read this so many times, hunters and gatherers. Okay, fine. They did hunt and they did gather and they fished. However, what that erases is the female agricultural society that existed here in what is now Maine prior to European colonization. So the women were the farmers. They were in charge of agriculture. They were cultivating huge hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of acres of cropland here in Maine, growing corn as the staple crop. Was all over the state. Now, the men were not the farmers. It was the women. They were farming, and they were also the ones who controlled the trade and controlled the money. Now, I can just imagine a man from Europe showing up here in, the 16th century, 17th century, 18th century, on and on. What are they going? How can they even process that? Like women who are in charge of agriculture and trade and money and also decision making, so they just, all they can do is just write them out. So there's this long erasure of the agricultural tradition here in Maine and the replacement with the hunter-gatherer kind of replacement narrative. The other interesting culinary thing that I've discovered is that the ancestral Wabanaki, when the Europeans showed up here, they were using all the resources around here, and they were growing corn, but they cultivated nut forests. So all of Maine, from the historical record, at least along the coasts and the rivers, seems to have been cultivated as a nut forest over generations. Now, anybody who knows the history of Maine knows that we became a logging state. The whole state was cut to the ground and logged in order to build, British ships and et cetera, et cetera. So those nut forests are gone. They were clear cut. And one of the things they were doing with those nuts is that they were making an infant formula long before Europeans ever had any dreams of making an infant formula. They made a successful one that was made with finely ground walnuts, which are probably the white walnut, which is native to this part of the country, finely ground cornmeal. And that cornmeal may have been roasted. And then that was boiled all up together to create a milk. And that was fed to the babies, and that could save a baby whose mother could not feed it. So there's that very interesting tradition, which I find fascinating. But there's also at the same time, a tradition of making nut butters and nut cream and nut cheese from nuts and sunflower seeds, and maybe other things. Here in Maine, we have birch trees, and birch trees have a natural preservative, antiseptic kind of thing in the birch. So if the Wabanaki ancestors made a birch bark container and stored their nut butter or nut cheese in it, it would last because there was a preservative in the wood. So they could have that without refrigeration, and they might have fermented it like people did today. I don't know. Most of this is lost to time in terms of what, ancestral Wabanaki people were making and how they were making it. But there are bits and pieces that survive in the archive, and that's what I've discovered, and I find that really fascinating because those are both female-centric traditions, both the farming and then the culinary preparation, just wiped right out of history. And instead, we're told that, milk from cows is the, the natural milk that we all should be drinking, and is what, people have been doing since the 1600s. Well, since the 1600s, but long before that, people were drinking another kind of milk that was based on walnuts and corn and sunflower seeds.
Well, that's fascinating. And it also begs the question, perhaps in even in European and other cultures, were people historically making certain similar types of cheeses and nuts and dairies and using the materials in a different way? Because the other erasure you're talking about is the erasure of these forests, of these nut forests, which is fascinating. I know I always think of nuts as being kind of a specialty crop. So something that requires a certain amount of specific husbandry and care. And so the idea that they could have been all over the rivers and coasts of Maine, that's just amazing. Beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
The beautiful image.
Yeah. It's really interesting, and it makes me sad when I think about what has happened here, but at the same time we're all here today, and the best thing that we can do going forward is try to figure out what has been erased from our past, how can that inform us going forward. So the more that we know about our history, the better choices we can make in the future. Because if we're just operating on, people have always been drinking cow's milk, that's just normal, natural, and necessary, and there's nothing strange here. Well, that's not the case. That was a new thing in the 1600s on this soil, and there had been other dairy products. I'm sure they weren't called dairy products, but there were other foods that were used in a similar way. And so now when people say, oh, you can't call a plant-based milk, I think that's a really weak argument, whether you're looking at language, seeing the word for milk and lactate comes from the Latin, which doesn't mean milking a cow. It means a milky white substance that could come out of a plant. So there's a long history, and you said in Europe there was a history of almond milk. During the Middle Ages, almond milk was the thing in Europe. That's what all sorts of people were using, was almond milk, and making it, in their kitchens and then using it in dishes. So there's a long tradition all over the world of milks that are not from animals, that are really the historical milk. And this whole idea of drinking cow's milk is a brand new thing, particularly fresh cow's milk. Nobody was drinking fresh cow's milk until like the late 1800s, early 1900s. Because the thing with cow's milk is you have to live right next to that cow to drink it. And people were living in cities, and so unless they lived on a farm, they couldn't drink this. So it's when you start getting dairies built in cities, which created a whole huge problems, because you had these chained cows standing in their feces and then being milked, and they were often fed really terrible food that was often like the leftovers of breweries and all kinds of stuff. It was real gross. And so they bred all sorts of zoonotic diseases, and then that's why you get tuberculosis from the milk and all these other things. So it was real gross, and that's as a result of that, people are like, well, this is gross and everybody's getting sick and babies are dying. What are we going to do? There were two camps. One camp said, well, why don't we clean up these farms and make it all really clean so that this milk will be pure and clean and not contaminated. The other camp said, well, why don't we just pasteurize the milk, the dirty milk, and kill the pathogens? Well, obviously the pasteurization camp won, and so that's what we have today. I grew up on a dairy farm, and I saw in the little tubes where the milk comes out of the cows, tubed up into this big tank out in the milk room. And in those clear tubes, you could see what was coming out. Sometimes it would be red when the milk was a little bloody because they had an infection. Sometimes it would be a little greenish from the pus. It often had flecks of brown. Now that was from the poop. That all goes into the milk tank, and then it's off and it's pasteurized. But that's disgusting. I mean, that's what's that's what's in milk. So people don't want to hear that, and they don't want to think about that. But, the Wabanaki didn't have to worry about this. And just like all the other native tribes, they didn't have zoonotic diseases over here because they did not confine animals. Confining animals, messing with their habitat, these are the ways that zoonotic diseases spread to humans. Zoonotic diseases are diseases that can spread from animals to humans. COVID being our most recent example, but it includes every disease that you can think of: tuberculosis, flu, measles, smallpox, chickenpox, diphtheria, on and on and on. They're all zoonotic. So when the Europeans came over with all their diseases, the Wabanaki and the Wampanoags and all the other indigenous people living here had never been exposed to that. So they were wiped out, in these pandemics. They weren't killed off entirely, but it really destabilized their societies and caused, tremendous cultural change and upheaval.
This is always my background is in history of art, specifically, but it's still all history. And I always think of history very much as a conversation we have with the contemporary historian, whoever the historian is at the moment, with the past. And that conversation changes each generation, or even more frequently. When I was a young woman, there was nothing about women in most histories, and there was certainly nothing about women artists until the famous book about why are there no women artists, great women artists. And so then there's a new conversation. So all of these things, sometimes I think people think, oh, you're all looking for trouble. We're not. We're looking for what's missing, and we're looking for the erasures. And that's where, and we have proven over the last 50 years how much is still out there for us to look into. I've never met a historian that's gone, oh gosh, I've run out. There's nothing there for me.
Oh, there's so much. Well, and I think one of the most interesting historical erasures that has been exposed and disproven recently is the cultural myth that the Anglo-Saxons in England, that the elite Anglo-Saxons ate a meat-based diet. And now that has been in every history book going on, a long time, almost 1,000 years. We've got that myth in the history books. Then just recently, researchers did bone analysis of more than 2,000 skeletons from that period and found that there was no one was eating a meat-based diet, of animal-based diet. They were all eating cereal grains, and that once in a while the peasants would put on a big feast for the elites that served animal bodies. But everything else is everybody eating cereals all the time, and their vegetables, cereal grains, not cereals as we think of them today. But that's what everybody was eating. So now modern science has shown that was a replacement narrative that has been in the historical archive for almost 1,000 years. So there's just one, so it's really interesting. I mean, I just feel like from the work that I've done, I'm very skeptical of a lot of history, because I just, I don't know, might be right, might be getting some of the facts right, but what is being left out? What is not being said?
Well, the best historians I know always say, that's my understanding of the information of the research I've got. That's my argument. That most historians don't go, that's how it was. Right. The best ones. Usually it's downstream from historians where people go, well, that's just how it was, because that's what that historian argued. But it's still that conversation with the data, with the research, with the now we have so much, as you're saying, with these Anglo-Saxon bodies recovered, we have tremendous, I'm going to blank on the research that they use, but these different spectrum analysis of bones. I think they can look at the little bones in the ear and get a tremendous amount of information about where they were, what they were exposed to, what kinds of nutrients they were exposed to.
Right.
It's fascinating. It's really fascinating. So it's never done. So if we say, well, that's how it was, that's how we think it was. And we might be right, but we're unlikely to be fully right. So I think that's fascinating. My mother's family, we call ourselves swamp Yankees, or long-term English settlers on the East Coast from the 17th century. And my grandfather had 3 or 4 cows, I think at the most. He was a subsistence type of farmer, and he would never let his kids drink anybody else's milk, because he knew he took care of his cows. He knew that he hand milked them. He didn't like the machines, and he sold what they didn't need. And he was always like, no, don't drink any. No, I don't drink any milk. I'm gone from that whole product. But even he, as a dairy farmer, or as a farmer, was skeptical about how good that would be for you. It's certainly people who had large herds.
Right. Oh yeah, that's really interesting. My mother-in-law in the 50s, she contracted tuberculosis from drinking raw milk here in Maine. So it's a very real threat. And the other aspect of milk that kind of makes me think a bit is, like, where I live in Portland, there are all sorts of people of different nationalities and ancestries and backgrounds. And we've had a lot of new Mainers move here, asylum seekers, many of them from sub-Saharan Africa. And now, if you look at the ability to digest milk after infancy, it's something that's almost exclusively the ability of people with Northern European ancestry, not even Southern European, like Italians, have a hard time with this. But certainly by the time you get down to sub-Saharan Africa, it's almost 100% of people cannot digest this. So now in the schools here, which do a great job trying to feed, thousands of kids a day, they pump out so much milk. Everything is a carton of milk, and here's a milk. And you should see how many of these milks don't get drank during the day, because kids don't drink milk. I mean, that's one of the things that I find funny about this is, like, I know a lot of people with a lot of kids, and most of them are not vegetarians, but they're not like feeding them glasses of milk. Like, that's what I remember in the 70s and 80s, like people were given milk. But I'm sure there's parents who do that, but that's not much of a thing around here. But then you go to school and you've got the beef burger and the cow's milk. So it's like, what the heck is that? So I find that is actually a form of racism for these kids who have something other than Northern European ancestry, because if they drink that milk, then are they going to sit there with a stomach ache all day? Some people get ear infections when they drink milk. So there's all sorts of very uncomfortable things that aren't going to help you learn if you just drank a carton of milk. So I think that, and the milk is totally subsidized, and we could go on and on about the government policies that are putting that into school lunches. But I mean, at its heart, it's sort of a racist policy, because it's just assuming that everybody is of Northern European ancestry, which is just not the case.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I have to say, when I was a young girl, I had chronic stomach aches and chronic, my brother had the ear infections. I had the strep throat, and our family physician told my mom, I think they're intolerant to dairy. I think because we were given milk all day long. First, my mother considered it a perfect food. Just that was the kind of dietary, nutritional background she had as a nurse. That's what she had been taught. Mm-hmm. And I remember even when the doctor said it to her, she goes, "That's nonsense," because that's how completely immersed she was in that belief system. Mm-hmm. It is as, and you used the same quote that I have another guest who I think when I'm talking to you, she will probably be the week before. Melanie Joy, PhD, is the one who I think has made popular that idea that animal products are, by our society, have been made natural.
Normal, natural, and necessary.
Necessary.
Yes, that is right out of Melanie Joy's work. Yeah, she's amazing.
Yeah, I think she's fascinating in the way that she kind of unapologetically says, we've incorporated, it's in our, so if anybody's having trouble, and this is what I do as a life coach, if people do have trouble moving towards the vegetarian or vegan or plant-based lifestyles that they want to, it's not surprising. And they need to give themselves a little pass that it is hard, because we've all been indoctrinated for good reasons and bad, but even for good reasons, by people we love most who were worried about us. They thought they were doing the right thing.
Right. I don't think anybody's trying to, like, when I say that, cow's milk is inherently racist when you serve it to school children, I don't think there's anybody out there sitting there going, oh, great, how can I be racist today? No, nobody's doing that. It's just, it's a system. So when things become systemic, you've got to make a big effort to change it, or else you just keep doing the same thing you've always done. And if that's racist, well, then you're still racist, So that's where we are. But yeah, I think that Melanie Joy is really a helpful person to look at this kind of stuff. One thing that I noticed in interviewing vegetarians all these years is that long-term vegetarians are a special breed of people. I know all sorts of people who've become vegetarian and then they're not vegetarian, or they're trying to be vegetarian, or they're semi-vegetarian. But as I mentioned earlier, vegetarianism is a social change movement. So when you say I'm a vegetarian, that's all you have to say, or I'm a vegan, and you've made a social change statement, and your grandmother's mad and the guy over here is rolling his eyes, you know what I mean? And why they're reacting that way, even though they don't know it and you don't know it, is because you've just made a statement that you're trying to change things. And so that the issue of long-term vegetarians, why I say they're interesting, is because I think it takes a certain personality type. It takes a really tough personality type who can handle all the negative social reactions and continue to just do what they're going to do. People who are people pleasers, if they just live to, please everybody else, they're never going to be a vegetarian. If you're trying to please someone else, you cannot be a vegetarian unless you're living in a vegetarian commune or something, because everybody else around you, the majority of people are not going to be vegetarians. So that's going to be uncomfortable and difficult. But, long-term vegetarians, they're not going to be easily persuaded into, other notions and stuff, because they've got a strong sense of what they're doing. But, I think that's why it is so difficult to be a long-term vegetarian, and why so many people adopt vegetarianism and then they're not a vegetarian anymore, because it's the whole social pressure.
Yes. And if they're having trouble, they should call me. They should call me, because this is the work we do. We understand, because I think so many people think that it's because they're weak, or because they're lazy, because they're distracted, or no, it's because our system is not set up to help you. And so you can do it. And I identify a little bit on the pleaser continuum. And it was hard for me. And it was why I didn't commit for a long time. And I think I've talked about it a million times, but I called myself an excusitarian for a very long time, that I was vegan unless there was a really good excuse in my head about being with my family, or a holiday, or a traditional food, or travel, or something like that. So, and if I could do it, this is my whole message. If I could do it, anybody can get way better at it, can get really, and you can't do that practice without practicing.
Right.
Failing at it is part of getting better at it, in my opinion.
Right. And I would think that, I don't know, what sociologists would say about this, but I would think that, women who are not teenagers and in their 20s, people who have established their lives and have families and stuff, they might be better able to do this, because if you're a woman in this society, you've had to face a lot, and, to make it through, and you got to be a little tough to get, into your middle age. And, I think that's a great time for people to think about this. I think I just saw something that in England, there are now more people who are like baby boomers who are adopting vegan and vegetarian diets. And I'm assuming that might have something to do with health. But I also wonder, about, just the ability of people to take a stance and hold that stance. And, I know when I was in my 20s, it's more difficult, because you don't have the confidence yet, as a person. You're just still figuring out who you are and what you're doing and why. But, once you get a little older and have a little bit more confidence in what you're doing, maybe it's easier for people. I don't know, but I know that there's just tremendous social pressure for people to conform.
Absolutely. And back to that Melanie Joy quote, that normal, necessary, or normal, natural, necessary, those three N's. I think women of a certain age start to get a little, if not cynical, a little concerned. They start noticing other things that maybe they were told was normal, necessary, and natural. And they're like, that's not true.
Right.
So there's like a little wiggle room for many of us as we go through all these different life stages with our kids, or with our families, with our elderly, with our parents that are getting older. And we start going, I wonder if there's a little something different there, to look at it differently. Now, through looking at your work, I learned about something I did not know anything about, and that is the Vegan Museum that's in Chicago, and the work you've done there. I would love it if you would tell me a little bit about that and tell our listeners.
Well, so the Vegan Museum is the only vegetarian museum in all of the United States. They're in Chicago, and they're currently, I think, in the Evanston Public Library. So they have an exhibit that moves around, and it's often in libraries or university spaces. They would love to get a permanent location if they could ever raise the funds to do that. They do programming. During the pandemic, a lot of it was online, but I think they've gone back to in-person programming now. And I've been working with the museum to put together a story map of U.S. vegetarian history, going back to the 1700s, and, looking at some of the people and events that, have shaped the vegetarian movement here in the U.S.
And so some of those people are Sylvester Graham, right? Is that how I?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Sylvester Graham. He is like, so we remember him today because of graham crackers, of which he would disapprove, because they're filled with sugar and probably not all, whole grains. So Sylvester Graham in the 1830s and 40s, he was a massive celebrity. I mean, it's hard for people to understand this today because back then you don't have internet, you don't have TV, movies, nothing. All people had for entertainment was they could read books, they could read the newspaper, and they could go to lectures and events. And so the lecture circuit was huge back then. There were lectures all the time, every night, in a big city, there's probably a lecture you can go to, and people went to them. They were on science and archaeology and geology and all these different topics that people would attend. So Sylvester Graham went all over the Northeast with his lecture tour, which was called The Science of Human Life. And he would deliver a month's worth of nightly lectures on all sorts of health reform topics that were about, health, about your body, about what to eat, about, every bit of advice that we have today on how to have a healthy life is what they were talking about back then. Get enough sleep. Don't be stressed out. Eat a good diet. Drink plenty of water. Get some exercise. So that was all part of his message. And one of the things that I've discovered that I just can't even believe is not in the historical record. Why don't people talk about this? I mean, it's fascinating. Well, now I know why they don't. But so in 1834, Sylvester Graham is going around. At that time, whole wheat flour is already called Graham flour because of him. So his name is attached to there. It's not because he did that or made flour. It's just because he was telling everybody to eat whole wheat flour as opposed to refined flour, which was becoming more readily available. And if you refine flour, it doesn't spoil as quickly. So that was the economic motivation to have that white flour is that it could stay fresh longer. So he's telling everybody to eat whole grain bread, becomes Graham bread. He shows up in Portland and does a month's worth of lectures, super popular. Everybody's there night after night, huge crowds. For some reason, at the end of the lecture series, this was in June 1834, there was a riot and a group of angry men attacked the church he was speaking in, threw bricks through the windows, and made the lecture stop, and he had to leave through a back door. And he tried, another night he tried to come and do it again, and they wouldn't let him. And so he could never finish the lectures. So what the heck happened? That was reported in every newspaper, all the major newspapers across the country, this riot. People had all sorts of things to say about it, but they never really knew why it happened. Even in the reporting in 1834, what the heck happened? And they were all speculating. And there's one editor who says something to the effect of, well, I can understand if, Sylvester Graham is trying to cram that bran bread down the mouths of a bunch of husbands. I can understand why they're upset. So everybody is assuming that it's because of his vegetarian message that this riot occurs. Okay, so maybe it was, I don't know. Well, April Haynes, who is a scholar, she's written about this. And what she discovered is that it was not the bran bread and the vegetables that caused the riot. It was another part of his message. So we have to think 1834, women have no rights. They can't, own property. They don't have the rights to their body. Think about just our, Harvey Weinstein, think about that kind of culture, the Me Too and everything that we know about now. Well, that was all going on back in 1834, except that women had no recourse. If somebody is trying to, violate your body, what the heck are you going to do in 1834? So people don't have rights. One of Graham's messages was that in addition to having a temperate approach to not drinking alcohol, eating a better diet, all this stuff, being real temperate, he also said, don't have so much sex. Stop having so much sex. Just have it, at most once a month and only do it for procreation. Okay, fine. That's a fine message. And that never caused problems when he said that to men. But when he told that to women, problems. And what I take from that is that if I was a woman in 1834 with no bodily autonomy, no rights, there's, who knows what kind of mix I'm in, somebody tells me that it's healthy to limit your sexual relations Well, that's kind of empowering. You know, because then these people who might be harassing you, well, sorry, you know, I've got to protect my health. That's not healthy, you know. So I don't know that it actually, you know, protected anybody, but it gave women a power that men did not like. So April Haynes has traced some of the people who got up the riot here in Portland, and they were all philanderers, and they had you know, kind of nefarious financial doings, and they weren't, you know, they weren't great guys. So that really kind of supports the idea that this was why that riot happened, is because he was trying to empower women to have control over their body and take control of that. And, you know, the certain men did not like that message at all.
Well, that's fascinating. And, you know, this is the subtext of all my work is that our thoughts are the most, they're how all our results happen. An idea is the most powerful thing in a human life. What we believe, what we think is possible for ourselves, what we think is not possible for ourselves. And when you are in a culture where you think certain decision making about your body and about sexual relations is not in your purview, it's not your choice. And then to have even the introduction of an idea of, wait a minute, you mean that's potentially optional? It's possible it could be different. This is a lot of people have tried to keep us from lots of ideas over the years. That's fascinating. Right. That is really fascinating. And this is the idea of veganism and vegetarianism in our current day. It is increasingly becoming something we think of as possible, as potentially possible, which for many of us feels impossible, but for many of us 50 years ago, when people were when there was a bigger movement in the 70s of vegetarianism, it was tough. It was very hard. It was very hard. You had to just decide.
Right. And one of the things that I find fascinating, so like the 70s, you're right, like 1970s, huge stuff going on with vegetarianism. A lot of it's traced to Frances Moore Lappé's 1971 Diet for a Small Planet, really kicked things into high gear, but there were other things happening. But yeah, what is interesting is when you see the reporting about vegetarianism in the 1970s, it's a fad. Look at this new thing, vegetarianism, the new fad. Well, they say that every time. I mean, I can show, you know, they were saying that 100 years prior. Oh, look at this fad of these people having, you know, vegetarianism. So every time vegetarianism comes up, people try to label it as a fad or as a diet. Because if you label it a diet in America, that means it's something that's changeable, is not going to last long. You're only going to do it for a short period of time and has no other element to it. God forbid somebody call it a social change movement, you know, that's, you know, gets everybody's back up. So, you know, I think that it is, when you're looking at the history, you'll see this over and over again, all these little ways to try to erase the history of vegetarianism. And one of them is to call it a fad. It's a fad. It's not, you know, because that says, well, there's not, you know, 2000 some odd years of history of this. This is just some new thing, some, you know, kooky people just came up with.
Yeah, I think that's remarkable. I'm wondering if you have a I don't know, reading list, but a prescription. I know everybody, I'm going to be asking them to follow you and follow your work. And I'm going to link them also to the Vegan Museum in Chicago, because I know that they have lots of information there. But where would you, if you were suggesting for the listeners, where they could kind of learn that this is not just a new thing. It didn't just happen with the new documentaries or game changers. It's not, you know, I have a complicated relationship with the term plant-based. So, but I use it because I think whatever works to help people move in the direction, whatever works. But where would you, as a journalist, as a historian, push people to investigate? Well,
there are two major books, and I was up in my other office with a whole bunch of other books. I could pull them out, but they're not behind me. So there's two major books that are histories of vegetarianism in America. One is called Vegetarian America, A History. and the other one is called The Vegetarian Crusade.
Mm.
And both of those would be a great starting point in order to get, an introduction to this history. Those are specifically in America. There are other ones that take a more broader view, kind of a more, scope of like Western history of vegetarianism and that sort of thing. But those two are specifically focused on American vegetarian history.
That's great. So I'm going to link those in our social media and in the show notes for today's episode
Awesome.
with you, Avery. And of course, I'm going to have all your contacts in there. And I'm hoping everybody's going to just maybe ask questions about their local newspapers. Who's covering vegetarianism and history? Who's covering vegan economics, vegan business in our local? One of the great concerns I have about our country in general is our local newspapers. We have a hard time keeping our local newspapers subscribed to. So also, if this doesn't help Avery, but subscribe to your local newspaper.
Definitely do it. Yeah. I mean, vegetarianism aside, if we want to preserve our democracy, which is now in peril, and we all know this, I mean, newspapers are one major thing that, a democracy thrives on, is a free press and the ability to get information. And yeah, I would really encourage everybody just to subscribe to their local paper. You can get online subscriptions now, and they're really affordable. So that's a great way. The paper that I write for, they have online subscriptions, and so that is a really, really important thing. And I think that also, people asking their local newspaper to cover these things, super helpful. I mean, it's just like, asking the local restaurant to add vegan stuff. Ask your local newspaper to cover this more. And the other thing, if any listeners are interested in history, my research here in Maine of the hidden vegetarian history of Maine shows that there is a hidden history of a lot of other states that could be pulled out, and nobody's done it for any of those states. Those two books that I mentioned, those are looks at the whole country, but there are quite a few states that seem to have some deep vegetarian history that could be explored from a state based perspective. So I think that's waiting. That's waiting there for people to jump into that project. At least that's what my historical research points to.
That's wonderful. So everybody's got their marching orders. All you historians, or you're taking a break, you're raising kids or helping with your elderly or whatever. It's waiting for you. Our culture, our history is waiting for us. And it's up to us to have that conversation with our local history, because it's all part of our national identity, and it's all part of, I know that in terms of the local newspapers, I'm very guilty of not knowing who my very local decision makers are very often. I have to really make an effort to know who are the town managers and the town council people who are actually making really important decisions about how we function in our town, because we're hijacked by CNN and MSNBC, which is great, Fox News, whatever. There's a lot of information there that's trying to get us. Mm-hmm. So let's look. We may have to work a little harder to find the things that are closest to us.
Right.
All right.
Right.
Avery, this was great. Is there anything else you'd like to share before I let you go? I want to be respectful of your time, and I know you've got a lot of other history to unearth.
I'm just so grateful for your time today and inviting me on your show. It's been a real pleasure and such a lovely time to chat about all this stuff with you.
Well, I'm delighted. Thank you so much for making time for us.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you, Avery.
So, okay, what did you think of Avery, Yale, Kamila? How much information did you just take in? Now, before I go any further, I want you to know that I have already asked Avery to come back in the new year and talk about just one of her many projects. I think today was like a vegan smorgasbord of nut milks, Native Americans, 19th century vegetarian social reformers, vegan soft serve school lunch, and so much more. I forgot to even mention that this conversation took place on Indigenous Peoples Day, and Maine is one of those states that no longer has a Columbus Day celebration. They do have the Indigenous Peoples Day. I did not realize that until our conversation. And I never even got to ask Avery about her work protecting local pollinators and the impact of fertilizer and pesticide legislation in her part of the world. So if anyone thinks that veganism is a niche and fringy, impractical fad, I think that Avery has demonstrated quite the opposite. There is a venerable history that includes economics, politics, feminism, cultural history, environmental protection, health, education, land management, public school systems, and other areas of social justice. I want to thank you all. I want to thank you all for listening and joining me here today, and in general, supporting Veg Your Best. And I thank you for all the kind messages and great ideas you've shared with me across these 112 weekly episodes. Sticking with me has given me the opportunity to reach out to more and more people to come in and discuss their ways of being vegan and vegetarian and plant-based with us. So next week, I'll be back from Italy, and I'll be back with a solo episode, which I hope will include some thoughts and lessons learned from traveling in Italy as a vegan. But until then, all of you, veg your best. Veg Your Best podcast production, music, and editing by Charlie Weinshank. Thanks, Charlie. Before you go, it would mean so much to me and the Veg Your Best team if you would hit subscribe, leave us a 5-star review, or share with someone you think might be interested. Something about algorithms, it helps bump us up a little in the rankings, and that's the best way to help others find the podcast and for us to find our audience. So, until next week, make it easy and veg your best.